Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joseph Atick, Executive Chairman of ID for Africa, and I'd like to welcome you all to this 8th episode of our LiveCast series. Thanks for choosing to be with us. I know there are many events this week around the world. Today, we have an exceptional and very timely program. But before we delve into it, I'd like to make a few quick announcements. First, please select your language. There are English and French channels, as there will be segments where someone on the panel will speak in French. Second, if you are watching this in replay on YouTube, please do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell. We will continue to bring out lots of high quality and fresh content. Of course, ideally, it is best for you to join us live so you can be the first to know and can be part of the dialogue and the live experience through the chat, Q&A, and the community voices. The replay is part of our commitment to building a public goods library focused on ID4D topics, which can be consulted at any time and used for capacity building and strategic planning. Third, remember, if you're interested in joining the community voices, please raise your hand electronically at the time when I invite community voice participation. The operator will contact you and prepare to elevate you to the panel. But please be pertinent to the topic and make sure your camera and microphone are working with good lighting. Now, I'd like to call your attention to something very important, the upcoming events. We have a very exciting lineup. First, we have coming up November 5th, Spotlight on Tanzania's Identity Ecosystem. This is part of our Country Progress Reports series. We did Nigeria first, now Tanzania, to examine Tanzania's progress in building its identity ecosystem and servicing its population. There's a rich story here to tell and lots to be learned. So please do not miss it. We will have with us representatives of all the major identity stakeholders, and we will announce the lineup next week. Second, coming up December 3rd, there will be a session called Digital Public Goods Initiatives as a Pathway to Identity Development, another important and timely topic, which will be part of a series we'll continue in January on the pathways to developing identity as a public good, which will include actually a focus on standardization and interoperability in subsequent episodes. Then, coming up December 8th to 10th, we have what I would call the mother of all events, a new event concept. This is absolutely live, not pre-recorded, which will be created in response to what you've been asking us for. It's called the ID for Africa Marathon. It will focus on innovations in business and technology that will help adapt government and private practices to the new realities of our times. You asked for it, and we are delivering. So please mark your calendars. Don't miss this event. Back to today's episode, which is dedicated to a subject that has risen to the top in importance this year, namely social protection. The session will explore the use of digital identity in social protection within the context of emergency responses brought about not only by the COVID pandemic, but also in the context of refugees. We have an amazing lineup of experts and frontline practitioners in this domain. Let me welcome them. Let me bring them on. Operator, please bring on. We have R.Palacios from the World Bank. We have E.Mowbray from Iris Guard. We have R.Karanja from Omidyar Network. We have M.Koudekan from Togo. We have N.Zeitoun from World Bank Egypt. We have M.Sy from Senegal. We have K.Srarah from Jordan. We have A.Hopkins from the UNHCR. So please help me welcome all of the panelists. Thank you very much for being with us. Did I miss anybody? I think I got everybody. If I missed you, please let me know. We're going to conduct this session in the following segments. We're going to have first the keynote, then the country reports, then we're going to have the refugee and IDP experience, and then we're going to have an InConversation with Omidyar Network, R.Karanja and myself. And then we will integrate discussions and community voices all throughout. So get ready to be part of the dialogue and the discussions. We have a packed program. So without any further delay, I'd like to ask Robert to step up to the panel and share his screen for his keynote. While he's doing this, let me say a few words about Robert. Robert, of course, needs no introduction. He is a renowned expert in social protection, pensions, and ID4D. I met Robert first in the context of the India Aadhaar project over 10 years ago, which led to a collaboration that laid the foundation for ID4D at the World Bank and resulted in the founding of ID for Africa in 2014. Robert continues to be on the board of ID for Africa. Robert, thank you for being with us today and for your continued guidance of the movement. So Robert, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, and thanks for this invitation. And I'm very happy to be part of ID for Africa once again. Good afternoon to all of you in Africa and Europe, and good morning to those of you in my part of the world. What I'm going to present today is based on a paper which you can find at the World Bank's G2PX website, which was recently launched. For those of you who are not familiar, the Government-to-Person Payments Initiative, which has Gates Foundation financing behind it, is a sort of natural companion to the ID4D initiative, which you all know about already at the World Bank. It focuses on improving the way social assistance payments are made to make them more financially inclusive, digital, and to empower women. This initiative was coincidentally just launched just before COVID, and we had no idea just how important it was going to be looking at digital payments as social assistance has been scaled up to such an extent. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the midst of a historic expansion in social protection, both in terms of coverage and spending. In the COVID-19 crisis context, we can think about three kinds of beneficiaries of social protection programs. The formal sector workers, those at the top of that pyramid there, informal sector workers, and those who were already receiving social assistance benefits before the crisis hit. And these people are typically rural households and poor. Now, in rich countries, most people are in the top in that orange box triangle there. And these people are fairly easy to deal with because you have them in your databases for income tax and for social insurance purposes. They're fairly easy to pay wage subsidies, for example, or unemployment benefits to the formal sector workers. And it's possible to find them and pay them cash transfers as well. This was what the strategy was in places like Japan and the US, while wage subsidies were more prevalent in Europe. But in low and middle income countries, only the minority are in that formal sector. In fact, in low income countries, typically more than 70 or 80% of the workers are in the informal sector. And only a relatively small number are in the social assistance database, receiving those transfers. The difficult part is that missing middle. And that group is the largest group in most of the developing countries we're working in. We need to add beneficiaries to the government's beneficiary list from this group to address the effects of the crisis. We count roughly 100 countries that have actually done this, announced that they're going to have new cash transfer beneficiaries added in the context of COVID. Now, among these 100 countries, we took a look at about 70 countries that were low and middle income and that had announced that they were going to expand their beneficiary roles. If they were to achieve their goals, they would benefit more than 1 billion people in these regions that you see here. East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, and Africa. Now, if you look at the bar chart on the right, you'll see that the average share of the population that could expect to receive this new cash transfer, this is in addition to anyone who's already receiving a cash transfer, ranges from, say, 20% in Africa to more than 40% in East Asia and in Latin America. Now, these numbers are numbers we've never seen in the world before in terms of the percentage of the population that would receive a cash transfer. Now, these are very ambitious numbers, but what we also see is that many countries have struggled to actually make the payments. There was no time for elaborate application processes or gathering data on the ground, especially in the context of COVID and social distancing. Instead, they had to rely on data that they already had, and new data had to be brought in, submitted electronically, usually online or through a mobile phone application. What you see in the graph here are the number of countries that had announced that they were expanding benefits by week, starting in middle March to early May. The red bars show countries that announced, and the orange bars show countries that had announced and actually implemented. So you can see that over time, the late announcement countries were failing increasingly to be able to implement their promises. They still may happen, but by June 30th, these countries in the red column had not been able to implement their payments. If you look at the other chart, what you have is a scatter plot of the countries that have announced by June 30th their new cash transfer programs. And you have on one axis a measure of financial inclusion, the percentage of the population with bank accounts. And on the x-axis, you have a composite indicator of the ease of identifying beneficiaries through the coverage of the ID system and social insurance database. And what you can see is almost without exception, the countries that were able in red to implement, those are the countries in red. The countries in blue were not able to implement during this time frame. The countries in red all had good, robust ID systems with very few exceptions. So despite these announcements in the second half of March, many countries have not been able yet to finish this process. And many of them had the advantage that were able to succeed, had the advantage of having a social registry, but others had to collect data online. Now, looking at a subset of these countries, of the first wave countries, as I call them, we see that with one exception, all of the countries were able to use cross-checking of databases to find their beneficiaries. So you have two approaches. One, where the social registry is already in place, and as we'll discuss in a moment, some social registries cover a large percentage of the population, and therefore you can leverage that to find this missing middle. In other cases, new applications had to be taken in because those data were not there. And you can see the countries that did those things, and some of them used both methods. But almost all the countries were able to use a unique identifier to cross-check between those applications or the people in the social registry and other administrative databases, especially the case of social insurance databases, which would tell you if the person was in the formal sector or not. But you can see social registries played a big role. The cross-checking, the one exception to the cross-checking that you see there is the Philippines. Now, the Philippines had a lack of a unique ID. They did not have a national ID that could link these databases, and this really impeded their process and slowed things down. They also had a very high number of duplicate payments because of the lack of ability to establish uniqueness. It slowed down their processes quite substantially, to the point that the government came out of this experience realizing the importance of the national ID, and they fast-tracked the national ID project. And in fact, just a few days ago, they started their enrollment for the first time. Now, going back to the social registry, we all in this audience, I think, know a lot about identification systems, but maybe less so about social registries. So let me just say a word about what we mean by that. This definition that you see on the screen, it comes from a flagship report that some of my colleagues at the World Bank wrote and published just a few months ago. And it's really about the information systems that support all of the processes that result in your ability to determine who is eligible for a social program. And I encourage you to look at that volume if you are interested in getting into more depth. I also wanted to quote an earlier World Bank report on the subject by some of my other colleagues, which really was pointing out how essential a unique identifier is to building a good social registry. And not only for verifying the identity of the individuals in the social registry and ensuring their uniqueness, but also cross-checking with other databases. So this is not just something that would be done in an emergency period, but something that would be done regularly to establish whether these people are eligible for programs. But social registries are not all the same. In fact, some social registries cover a relatively small proportion of the population. So you can see here the bars show you that from a range of 20% coverage to more than 85% coverage of the population. Now, if you have 80% of the population in your social registry, you're in a much better position to find the people in the missing middle than if you have a very small percentage covered. The second distinction is by the color, blue and red. The blue countries are those that use what we refer to as census sweep methods. So periodically, they'll send around enumerators to each household, sometimes in certain geographic areas, and they'll collect data from these households, which will then be used to provide a score, which will determine whether they would be eligible for a program, depending on the type of program. The red bars refer to countries that have what we call virtual social registries, which pull data from various administrative databases in order to determine the eligibility of the households. And I would note again that unlike an ID database or many ID databases, these are household-based databases, and that's an important additional layer that allows the social protection programs to operate. Now, the first approach is fairly static, and because these are done every 3, 4, 5, even more than that years, you have a problem of updating in some of the more static registries. Again, I'll have to use the Philippines as an example. They have a very widespread coverage of their social registry, but were unable to use it in the pandemic context because it was just considered too out of date. So that led them to have to do a very manual application process at that time. In this diagram by my colleague Valentina Barca, you can see a little more clearly the different types of social registries. The one on the right that you see, which starts with the data collection, is really the census sweep type of approach, where you collect a lot of data about a lot of households, and then it feeds into a social registry. Whereas in the one on the left, to it, the virtual social registry, you'll use the existing administrative databases and pull from them, so you're not collecting the data multiple times on the same households and the same individuals. The social registry on the right is something more typical of the blue bar countries, Rwanda, Pakistan, for example. In the case of the virtual social registry, we have cases, and you'll hear some today, like Turkey, Chile, which are pulling from these databases. In the case of Turkey, pulling from 24 different databases, from property registries and income tax registries and auto registries and so on. Now, the advantage of the virtual registry, in my mind, is that it tends to be more up-to-date. It tends to be more dynamic. And so you're pulling data from different places. This does raise questions about data aggregation and issues of privacy as well, which need to be addressed. But it is, in many ways, a more effective way of doing this. It does, however, require a fairly digitized government setting and a very high coverage of your ID. Now, some of the first wave countries that we discussed are already starting a new round of payments, while some of the countries that have not been able to do so are searching for new ways to try to identify these beneficiaries because they don't have those assets in place. So some of the new approaches that we're seeing coming out could actually become innovations that are used in the future. Things like using geospatial data and mobile phone usage patterns, or call data records, as we call them. Now, where mobile penetration is very high, and this is sort of a new phenomenon, and even in low-income countries now we see very high mobile penetration. The correlations between the ground truth in terms of data collected through surveys and the behavior of mobile phone behavior allows you to predict consumption and consumption losses and poverty almost as accurate, or as accurately in some cases, as traditional methods. Now, one issue with this is that if you're doing this at the individual level, the more data that you have on the individual's behavior, the more accurate. But that obviously raises questions of the consent of the individual for using that information and potential privacy issues as well. An alternative to this is to aggregate and have anonymized aggregated data at a geographical level, which could allow you to do some targeting along those lines. Several countries are considering this that we're working with. Bangladesh, Mali, Nigeria are considering this type of approach. Another approach is the use of satellite images or drone images combined with machine learning to predict various indicators of poverty that could be useful. In the map here on the, I forgot to mention on the right, you have a map of Rwanda where this was applied, and you can see the granularity which you can reach in terms of geographic targeting. And in the left case, that's something some of our teams have worked on in Cartagena, Colombia. And I won't go into the details there. The World Bank is, another example, is sponsoring a project in the DRC right now, which plans to combine satellite-based geospatial data and high-frequency surveys to target emergency COVID-19 transfers to about 250,000 households in Kinshasa. Telecom data can be linked to the eligible geographic areas and then can be used for self-registration by mobile phone. The figure shows the initial results of this poverty targeting exercise. Now, so far I've been talking about the role of ID and databases and innovations, innovative ways to try to find people. But ultimately, we're still going to need to have some of these assets to make the payments. I haven't talked about the actual payments side. So here I wanted to show you some of the methods that some of the early implementer countries have used to deal with the problems of making digital payments in particular in the COVID crisis. Nobody wants to be making cash payments if it can be avoided, ideally into actual bank accounts. And so this is something we would like to see happen even before COVID, but it becomes even more necessary during the pandemic. So the ones I've circled here are the measures that address problems in identifying beneficiaries, opening bank accounts. These are identity-related measures. And again, if you have some of the assets in place, you can address these. So for example, if you have a good social registry, a broad social registry, for example, in Colombia, you're able to use that for simplified customer due diligence to open accounts. Because the data is considered robust enough to be used, at least in a temporary way, to have relaxed KYC. If you have a good digital ID system, you can do remote onboarding much more easily than if you don't. And finally, if you think about the case of India, and the ideal situation would be one where we see that there's an ID-linked bank account that gives you great confidence that you are paying the right person and paying one individual only. Places like Thailand have this advantage. India, prior to the pandemic, had opened basic accounts for 200 million women. And this allowed the government to implement payments just within a few weeks to these 200 million women after they announced the pandemic benefit. Now, putting this all together, I wanted to just finish with this slide on Namibia, which had a system that in 10 steps in 5 minutes, you were able to register and direct your payment to a bank account. I think this is very impressive. This is something that could be done on a feature phone. It's something that is very easy to understand. Eventually, there were applications that were rejected through cross-checking. But ultimately, you had about 70% of the adults in Namibia receiving these payments within a matter of a few weeks of the decision being made to make this one-off payment. One can imagine that some types of systems like this can be used in the normal, in other crises and other pandemics, but also in normal times. So just some lessons from the COVID response. What we learned really is very clear now that many low-income and middle-income countries lack most, I would say, the data that they need to respond to these shocks. And it's really the non-poor informal sector that is outside of their database reach. Countries that have good, robust assets, especially good identification systems and social registries that have high coverage, were clearly better able to respond quickly with these cash transfers, suggesting the value of building these assets. Static social registries, while still useful, are not as agile, I would say, as the sort of virtual social registry concept that leverages across multiple administrative data sets. And building these assets, obviously, is something that countries are now realizing would facilitate future payments in future crises and allow them to quickly scale up. So I do see that there will be a structural shift in the way that social protection systems are going to work in the future and the kind of data that they're going to want to have and need on hand. And last thing I'll plug is the book that we put out in September of 2019, which advocated a significant expansion in the role of social assistance to a much larger part of the population. This is a book called Protecting All. It happened to come out just before the pandemic. And in that book, you'll also find a chapter devoted to the question of financing and the question of implementation, the kind of assets that we're talking about today that you need to be able to do this expansion and to cover, and really ultimately looking for universal coverage, either through social assistance or social insurance. So let me end there, and I look forward to the discussion and to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. Actually, I want to start in the discussion with you by sharing with you the results of a survey that ID for Africa had done about the interventions after COVID in Africa. So operator, could you please put the slides? I know Robert hasn't seen them, so I want to see your reaction. We'll show 3 slides from the study. There were 33 countries that have participated, and out of those 33 countries, 95% basically said that they had launched a government assistance program in response to COVID. And you can ask, what is the breadth of the government assistance in response to COVID? The majority, 40% of the respondents said it was less than 20%. So it was rather narrow, but surprisingly, it's not that narrow. There have been response, like 30% said it went above 20 to 40%. And then there was about 27% that said actually it reached about 60% of the population. So you can see a broader, even though in the African context, where we have the challenges of getting the budgets and getting mobilization, it seems to be that the interventions were broader than the 20%. Show the next slide, please. When we asked what were the types of interventions that your government selected, in this case, there were several types. And on the top are the temporary cash transfers in the informal sector. These are the ones that Robert, you highlighted in your presentation. Next to it, we saw a strong coming of business loan guarantee, something that, at least to me, I was surprised. It shows that the governments were looking at maintaining the employment, maintaining the economy. The wage subsidies was also in the formal sector, and then the temporary benefit increase in social assistance. There were a few others that talked about food programs and delayed tax payment, and then making electricity and gas free. Last slide. Yes, last slide. We asked, was ID necessary? In fact, 76% said yes. ID was definitely necessary for these programs. But then we asked what type of ID used. Surprisingly, in fact, not surprisingly, consistent with what you have said, it was basically whatever they had at hand. They did not have any capability to launch a new ID program. Only 9% said a new temporary digital ID was possible to put. The rest relied on foundational ID like the national ID, or heavily cross-checked administrative databases. Few said they had a social registry that was worth using, and then some said they used their voter ID. So anyway, to me, I don't see any surprises from this study. We thank the ambassadors of ID for Africa for having done that. It was each ambassador did its study per country. So this is an interesting view, because we have the platform, we have the access to the countries through the ambassadors. We managed to get a feeling for what was happening in Africa. And so, Robert, is there anything in this that you feel is surprising or noteworthy?
Well, I do want to make it clear that what I was talking about was only that 25% in that slide that reported temporary cash transfers being added. But if we look at all of those measures together, of course, it's a much broader segment of the population. In some countries, for example, subsidized electricity, the suspension of payments, that could cover a very large part of the population. And when you add up all the pieces of the formal sector and the top up of the already receiving social assistance beneficiaries, I can see how you can get to. I find those very reasonable results in terms of the coverage of the population. The cash transfer part of it for the new workers is, I think, the most difficult part, because those people are not in a formal sector database. They're not in a social assistance database. They're not just, it's not simply, there's not a business that's registered that we can look at. These are informal entities and people, and they're the hardest ones. And I think you'll hear in the coming case studies we're going to hear about, I know a few of them fairly well, how they overcame those challenges and found those informal sector people and registered them and got them in. But for me, the longer term lesson is, how do we make sure that we don't have to do this on an ad hoc basis each time?
Right. Okay. We've got a quick question. And also, if anybody wants to be in the community voices, please raise your hand. The question for you, Robert, came from the audience. What role, if any, do you think that civil registration systems can have in the effective issuance of social protection programs? What is the role of civil registration in social protection?
That's a very broad question, and I don't know we'll have time to give it enough of time for a good answer. In this particular specific context of the cash transfers, you can see, there are a lot of the benefits that we deal with are categorical benefits. So child grants, for example, or elderly grants. Ideally, that information should be cross-checked with the civil registry, and that should be the source of truth for things like the child being born and age of the person for the purposes of determining the eligibility. It shouldn't be something that I should have to collect on an ad hoc basis. It should be something I can draw from my social registry from. I'll give you an example. Where I am in the United States, millions of people received checks from the Internal Revenue Service who were already dead. In fact, one of my uncles received a check. And millions of people have received this because there isn't a timely and strong and well-functioning link between the civil registry and the social protection or the tax system. So we have a lot of problems in terms of tracking people who have died, even though somewhere there exists a record in the United States of the death of my uncle and others, but it's just not being linked. So I think the civil registry plays a role in that sense for sure. Ideally, it should be the ultimate source of truth for those things. And generally, it should be well linked with the ID system in such a way that they reinforce each other. So I don't know. I think it's a much broader question than I think we have time to answer right now. But from the narrow perspective of these cash transfers, having one in place that you can rely on makes things much better. The Namibia case is a very good example because they have a very well-linked civil registry and an ID program. That's the same agency. It's a seamless situation there. So you'd be pretty sure. I think on my slide I showed that there were rejections based on people being underage who had applied for the benefit, and based on people who were dead. And so those rejections were possible because the civil registry had good information and it was linked to the whole process.
Yeah, Robert, a question for you. How has your concept of the social registry changed over the last 10 years? I know in the old days we used to talk about the need to build social registries. Now we're talking about the need to make sure that they are timely. So how, if you had to give a policy recommendation to governments about building social registries today, what would you tell them?
Wow. So some of my colleagues are more expert on this question than I am. I'll try to say something simple about it, which is, to me, as you evolve your administrative data, you can reach a point where you should not have to be going door to door to collect 50 different variables and indicators. Ideally, you're building an administrative system that has interoperability and allows you to draw the data from the relevant source. As I mentioned, in the case of Turkey, 24 different databases. I think you'll hear some similar cases coming up in this session. This is a much less intrusive way of doing things. It's a less costly way, and it's a much more agile way of having timely data. If I have to go out with thousands of enumerators every 4 years to collect data, it's really not going to. It's going to be too static to be useful in the short run.
Robert, basically, but there's a consequence of this. If we believe that the social register is now essentially a dynamic link table, which basically cross-references more active sectorial databases, doesn't that necessarily imply that there needs to be a unique digital ID number to allow that link to take place, and therefore we have to live with that concept and the consequences to privacy and the population surveillance that this could lead to? I mean, I don't see how you can escape the fact that once you go down this path to say social protection needs to link information across databases, and whether you can say at the same time we don't have to have a unique identifier across them. I mean, how's that going to play out?
Well, Joseph, as you know better than I do, there is the possibility of having tokenized IDs and being able to link them centrally, but to have different sectoral IDs as they do in countries like Austria, so that it becomes at least one step more difficult to have this sort of instant data aggregation across. But yes, ultimately you have to be able, if you want to do this, you need to be able to link the databases. You just want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that it involves the consent and transparency, and that it's done for explicit, well understood and codified purposes, and that it can be monitored and checked so that you don't run into problems of misuse of the potential data aggregation. And it's a question I always ask when I am working with the country is who is doing this? What are the checks and balances on this very powerful tool that you have, but something that you can't take for granted will not be misused?
I see Jerome has made a point in the chat. Jerome, I invite you to be on the community voices. Your point is very important. Jerome is saying basically unique identifier does not mean there should be one number. So, I mean, we had this discussion a few months ago on the session that we dedicated unique ID. Jerome, would you be interested in explaining your idea just quickly, a minute? And if not, we will, let me see if there's another question for you, Robert. Do you anticipate the adoption of multimodal biometrics as a means of identity management? I guess this is not necessarily for Robert, but if you want.
No, I don't want to take that.
Okay.
I do hope Jerome wants to come in. You know, the ID4D group has, with the help of people like Jerome and you, Joseph, have really developed the ideas behind not having one number that has to be used for everything, and how this can be done in practice. I know you've had these discussions in the ID for Africa
yes.
in earlier times, but I think it's something that is so important and it's so new that we need to be clear and talk about it more and get everybody accustomed to it. Jerome,
quickly make your point. I mean, you've got basically all these administrative databases. They need to cross-reference them in order to decide if the person is eligible or not for targeting social protection programs. So how do you do it without having a unique ID number?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sorry for the video. I'll make it very quick. Yeah, thank you for Joseph for organizing this excellent event, and thank you, Robert, for your very insightful presentation. No, my point is very simple. We are currently working on models for implementers to avoid the terrible case of dealing with only one unique, ubiquitous, universal, permanent identifier, because this is an open door to profiling your members of the public, to potentially profile, in a position to profile. So we are currently working on models, and we're making quite great progress these days to generate multiple unique identifiers linked to the same individual. So basically creating correlation aggregation spaces, virtual spaces, to which a number of parties can belong to. Let's say all the agencies that would need to do those, to cross-check their database before delivering the service, would be able to register into a given tokenization or let's say correlation space. Of course, that implies a bit of system. You need to have the systems ready in order to do that, and a bit of organization also. But that's feasible, and that can scale rather easily. And so that's a nice way not to create an opportunity for profiling to happen at a massive scale.
Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, it is possible to get the benefits of cross-referencing without having the dangers of profiling through a unique number.
Absolutely. My points can be summarized this way. You can have interoperability. You can have background check, cross checks. It doesn't mean that you will have to have a unique, ubiquitous identifier for a given individual. You can complexify. You can stratify, complexify the model.
I think this merits a deeper discussion. I think we'll bring you back at some point to present the models that you guys are doing.
Joseph, can I just say one more thing on this point? So when these cross checks were implemented in these countries, there were questions that came up about the consent that was given by people to make these cross checks, and these are valid concerns because the data that had been gathered had not ever been gathered with that objective. So in some countries, one had to pass decrees or some kind of rules that said that allow this as a one-time thing, and then that this would this check would be eliminated or deleted, so to speak. But in the longer term, I think the lesson is that if you're going to do this interoperability and use these cross checks, then the rules have to be in place as well. What Jerome's talking about are sort of the technical options there, but we also have to have a legal framework that specifies how those data exchanges and cross checks can happen.
Okay, thank you, Robert. We've got a lot to cover today, so we're going to move on. Thank you so much for being with us. Nahla, World Bank, Nahla Zeitoun, World Bank Egypt, could you please give us a very short summary of Egypt's experience in the aftermath of COVID and use of identity?
Thank you very much. If you can allow me to share my screen, I'll go through a very short presentation.
Operator, please share the screen. Okay, they're doing it as we speak. If there is
I'm able to share it now.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
so thank you very much for inviting Egypt. Let me go quickly over the Egypt case in using the digital ID during the times of COVID. Just to give you some background, the idea for Egypt to establish a unified national registry started in the early 70s. But did not make too much progress at the time. It was slow, but the idea was there. The reason it was slow is because there was no unique ID. Things started to gain some traction after 1996, when Egypt launched its national ID project. The project was being led by the Ministry of Planning and the Ministry of Admin Development. And the progress, to be honest, it was building blocks, but it was slow. In 2017, the project took a big turn because the management of the project went to the Administrative Control Authority in 2017, and they started to work progressively on the UNR, also looking at cases from other countries like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. Just to give you an idea of this entity has some authority. It does report directly to the president. And it was mainly established to fight corruption, monitor government agencies' performance, and also to manage this unified national registry now. Basically, what they tried to do starting 2017 is Egypt, we are 100 million people, citizens. So they tried to profile the citizens into households. So these 100 million made up 23 million Egyptian households, and they now have a lot of information about these households, and they were able to categorize them into 5 categories, all using administrative data, of course. The 5 categories were extreme poor, poor, vulnerable, middle class, and rich. And basically, they've made this administrative categorization based on looking at certain variables like electricity consumption, car ownership, private versus public schools, and so on. Up to date, they've managed to connect 53 databases, 42 online and 11 offline. And they're starting to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to run simulations, for example, with respect to the food subsidies, to eliminate people, because food subsidies, there's a very high leakage. Almost 74 million people have cards out of the 100 million. And we know that a lot of people are not deserving. So the way they first try to clean is to see who is like in the rich category by like one factor variable. Like if you have a Mercedes or a Porsche, then definitely you don't need a food subsidy card. And then they will get into a more scientific way of actually targeting using the UNR. The challenge is, of course, when you connect databases, not all ministries have advanced databases, and the quality of data is also an issue. So we cannot just rely also at administrative data as if it's the given fact. There has to be some way to also do some cross-checks. During the time of COVID, the government was able to respond quickly by launching one-off payment for irregular workers, using actually the UNR as a cross-check. So people applied on a portal. We had 4 million applicants. And through running cross-checks against the social registry to make sure they're not part of the cash transfer program, and against the UNR, the government was able to identify 2 million out of the 4 million applicants. And these 2 million received an SMS to get their first payment, where they also got their ATM card to get their second, third, and now this will continue until the end of the year. So it started off as a 3-month temporary payment scheme, but it will continue for another 3 months. So it's going to be 6 months. Also, they've added more beneficiaries to the cash transfer program that was already an existing program. They've added 160,000 families. Right now, we have 3.1 million families, which is around 10 or 11 million people. And they got this pool out of the existing social registry. And when I say social registry, I mean the registry of people that have applied to the cash transfer program. We have 30 million people that applied and 10 million were found eligible. This is using proxy means tests and some other cross checks. So we have a pool of around 20 million rejected people. So what the government did is they went to the database of the rejected people and they took those that fall very close to the poverty line. Also, the government is right now using the Unified National Registry to launch the health insurance coverage law, because some people will get co-payment, and also it will, who are going to be these people, they are going back to the UNR to pilot this in one governorate. Going forward, I think the issue that was raised by Robert and also by Joseph, we are trying to work with the government to establish a legal framework to govern the UNR. The issues of data privacy and data sharing, of course, is at the heart of this. But also we need to also consider the financial model of the UNR. How is it going to be supported? Is it going to continue to rely on government budget, or there could be transaction fees on services delivered to citizens and investors as a way to actually fund the UNR? Let me stop here and give it over to Joseph. I hope I did not take too much time. I tried to be short.
Thank you, Nahla. Thank you, Nahla, for this overview. It's quite impressive to see that you could build a unified national registry through the consolidation of 55 databases. Now, let me ask, I mean, is there any concern in the public about the fact that this could amount to a massive consolidation of their lives? I mean, there's a profiling not just of people in need, but profiling across the, I mean, is there a discussion or a debate about this issue in the country?
There's a debate, honestly, with the World Bank. We are concerned because we are supporting the government on this, and that's why we were insisting on benchmarking to other country experiences, and the government is listening. They understand that this is an issue and they need to establish some legal framework. But at the same time, actually, this was very much supported by Parliament, by parliamentarians, because also parliamentarians feel that in terms of social protections, there are a lot of people that are undeservingly getting the social benefits. And when the Unified National Registry first started, their first objective was to clean the food subsidy, because we know that food subsidy is not well targeted. Of course, it's becoming more a project that is getting into other things like now health insurance. Also, the fact that they want to rely on administrative data is a bit worrisome. And I told them nothing can ever replace a survey, you know, going to a household and actually visiting a family and getting data. You cannot just rely on administrative data and run AI and simulation and decide to target programs or launch programs. So it is work in progress. We are working with the government on this. The legal framework is still not in place, but we are working towards that.
Okay. One final question for you, Nahla. I mean, to consolidate these databases, I assume they're done in a dynamic way. Have they invented a new platform? Like, for example, Estonia has an X-Road, which is a mechanism that allows the different agencies to share administrative data. Have they homegrown Egyptian platform for data sharing across the different administrations, or how are they doing this?
Yes, they're doing this. You know, there's this, I'm not a very technical person when it comes to these things, but there is something called like a service bus and government to government, but they're using also a lot of private sector providers. So we have IBM, Microsoft, Teradata. So they are relying also on private sector companies to help them broker this, because you do need this IT infrastructure. So they are relying on these companies to help them with this.
Okay, thank you, Nahla. We can talk more about this. Hopefully we can bring in more of the Egyptian story in detail in another future event. I'm going to continue quickly so we can catch up on the time. I'd like to ask Togo, please, to step up. M.Koudekan from Togo. Your turn. Thanks, Nahla.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to share our experience about the Novice program. So the mission of Togo government for this program was to help mitigate the drastic rise of national poverty level that will result from the confinement taken as measure against the COVID-19 virus. So next slide, please. Okay, so the program need to have some points. Okay, so the plan was to help people on this period so that they get minimum money to next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Next slide. Oh.
Okay. Okay. The help plan was about helping people with electricity bills and water bills, but the government engaged also in sending cash to people, the most vulnerable people, to get money from the government. But the big question was how to send this money to people with efficiency and traceability, and more importantly, how to make sure that they get that money with the minimum human-to-human contacts possible. So, as a technical team leader of the Ministry of Telecommunication and Technology, I work with our in-house team to build a platform that combine mobile technology as USSD, SMS, and mobile payments to set up a platform that automatically run this cash transfer program. And all this was possible because we have the chance, we have fortunately a fresh database of voter IDs that we use as base of this platform. So the voter ID database help us on uniquely identifying the recipient, and also help on targeting the geographical areas and also the professions. Why those aspects was important is because the help program that was accompanying the confinement is not global to all the country. The government decided to help the region that are facing COVID rush, and the confinement was located to some regions or some cantons. So having the geographical information linked to identification and also the professions, because the help is not sent to everybody. Only the profession that are most vulnerable get the help. So those information help us to build a system that allow next screen, please.
Next slide.
Next screen, please. So with that database and the platform we built, Togolese were able to register using their mobile phone. The basic one also work. They just need to dial USSD code, and they fill a short form that includes their voter ID, and also their a verification code that is on the voter cards, and also their name. So they just need to fill 3 forms, and automatically the system run a screening on the using the information in the database, in the voter database, and check if they are eligible. The eligibility is based on the area, as I explained before, and also the profession. So if your data match the eligibility criteria, you receive immediately a cash transfer by mobile money. So this, when the program launched, it was immediately a success because it was easy to use, and it reached people where they are in their location, and they don't need to bother about how I will go out and get that money. Next one, please. Okay. And the point that we think made the program a success was about the fact that it was digital, and you can enroll to the program from where you are, and you can do it by yourself using just your phone. And many people in Togo have a phone, and also a big part of the country had a voter ID, because we were just coming out of a vote period, an election period. So we have a fresh ID that people use to enroll to the program. And the program targets the place where are truly in need of that help. And also, it was not, the people are allowed to manifest their will to get that help. So it is not systematic. If you feel that you need that help, you register. It was volunteer. And the fact that the money reach the people immediately make it a success, because the people feel like it is a true thing, it is reliable. We also make sure that any transaction that was generated by the platform can be traceable, and also we make public a dashboard that help on reporting on what was going on. So everybody can access that dashboard and look at the data according related to the program. Next slide, please. Okay. To summarize the program, about 1.4 million persons enrolled to the program, and almost 600,000 get paid, 500.5 get payments, and 65% of those beneficiaries were women. And we can tell that the program was very helpful during that period, especially for the women that gets help on taking care of their lovers.
Okay.
Next step. And going through all this program and everything, the things we learn from it is like the need of having an identification system, a way to uniquely identify our citizen will be surely the basis of setting such programs, and also building social programs that can can help the population. And we learn all this, and from these experiences, the country, we had a ID program, a national ID program that was in plan, but I can say that the COVID and the Novici program helped accelerate things, and government is currently taking action to make this identification platform and program real in the next months. And we hope with this database or with this identification information, we will be able to build more efficient program like Novici. We will surely build upon Novici and also add other helpful programs that can benefit from this identification system.
Great, Morley. There's a question for you. Is this the only channel for cash transfer program in Togo, or are there other cash transfer programs that are more classical?
I can say that Novici was the first one that was built to be instantaneous, I can say, because the way we used to do this is like you need to provide a list, and you share with the mobile operator or mobile money operator that will process that list for you. And it is not easy to run the things that way in the context of emergency or in context like the COVID one. So we needed to build something that can work, I can say, in live.
Okay. Now, what about people that don't have mobile phones? How did you reach out to them?
Okay. People that don't have mobile phone, the first plan was that we allow people to register with others' phone. Can use, yes. But unfortunately, we noticed that this can lead to some kind of fraud, because it is like you use the phone of your mate to register, but when the money reach him, he doesn't
give it to you.
Yeah, those kind of things. So we later on blocked this possibility, and this make us notice that we need to make sure that more Togolese have a phone in their hands, and the government is working on this.
Thank you, Molly. Let me just point out to some of the questions that are being asked. You have a very, very nice website. Just type Novici online. You'll get it in English and in French, and you will get all the information you need. Some people are asking, where can we find it? Very nicely documented dashboard and documented website. Bravo. In fact, just to close on this, it was very fortunate that the voter ID not only proved identity, but it was also used for targeting, because you had the profession already in the database, you had the gender already in the database, and the geographic location. So you were able now to take data that was not necessarily needed for elections, but use them for social purposes. So here's an example of how data allowed you to be opportunistic. Anyway, thank you so much, Morley, for your participation. Sorry, we don't have too much time to bring in more questions, but I'm sure in the future we'll be examining that. Next, we're going to have K.Srarah from National Aid Fund, Jordan. Welcome, Khawla.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for hosting me today to participate in this webinar to talk about Jordan experience with the national ID and how it contributes to social protection programs and emergency response. I want to give you a quick introduction of Jordan. Jordan is a small country in its area and in the number of population on it. But nevertheless, it hosts a high number of refugees because it's located within an area full of conflict and wars. The poverty ratio before COVID-19 was estimated of 15.7%, and we expect that it increased during the COVID-19 crisis, but we have built many programs as a quick response, and for the medium response, we hope that we prevent this percentage from increasing too much. The national number that we use in Jordan is a digital. Can you please, for the next slide? Yes. We use the national number in Jordan, which is a numerical number. We started to use it from 1966 as an idea, which is started by establishing the Civil Status Department. But the real work was started in 1988 when the Civil Status Department started to computerize all the data on an MIS system and register all the national IDs for all the Jordanian individually in this database. In 1992 was the big change in using the national ID when the government issue an important decision that all the government documents should have the national ID to be proceeded. So no service could be given to any Jordanian people if they didn't have the national ID. This caused that all the people should have or be keen to have the national ID. In National Aid Fund, where I work, which is an institution that is responsible for providing cash assistance for people, for poor people and vulnerable people, we started to use the national ID from 1996 in papers and documents, but at 2002, we started the first MIS system, which we started to use the national ID and connected it with the Civil Status Department. Next slide, please. The national ID in Jordan is a numerical number from 10 digits. It's easy for use, for store, for linking between different databases. And it's, of course, it's unique and can't be changeable. And it's for each individual is a unique number. The next slide, please. And now in Jordan, all the Jordanian people have a national ID. It's given to them from the moment of birth, and even if they didn't get it at the birth, they have to get it in some way in their life, because they can't have any service or get any service from the government without using this national ID. Also, we have another ID for the family. We have two IDs, ID for the individual and ID for the family, and that's helped us in the social protection programs because we deliver our services as a families or a households. So this ID can get all the family as a booklet together. Also, we have a unique ID for non-Jordanian people, especially for refugees that are resident in Jordan. As I said before, we started in 2002 to use the national ID in the social protection programs, and we started to build the National Unified Registry, which is a platform that is connect all the government or the institution in Jordan, all the data to be held in this National Unified Registry we called Noor at Jordan. We started with a small number of institutions in the first, and now we are reached around 100 institutions, ministries and government institutions are related together in this National Unified Registry. The next slide, please. Yes, we have also around 1 million registered household. All their data are registered and calculated from all these databases and stored in this database. The next. The existence of this platform, Noor platform, help us in the National Aid Fund to provide or to implement our programs for the social protection. It helps us in both sides, from NAF side and from the citizen side. For example, in the registration, we have a very long registration form because our targeting system is built in many indicators, around 57 indicators, which needs many kind of information. But the good point that all these information came from these databases or from the Noor platform. So the beneficiary, when he wants to register for the one of the services that we provide, he found really a very long registry form, but most of the information are filled for him. He just wants to confirm that these information are correct and he is agree on them. We leave for him a small amount of information that are not included in this database, so he wanted to fill it. And this make it easier for us also to verify this information because it came from an official databases, so we are sure that it is correct, and it's reduce the effort to verify all this data by visiting the people. Also in payments, we use the Noor or the databases that are connected to us because we use only the electronic payment system to give the cash assistance for people, which is the basic bank account and the e-wallet accounts. And all of these are connected to our database, so we can verify the account through the CBG or the Central Bank of Jordan or through Jobac company, which is hold all the database of the e-wallet accounts, also depending on the national ID. So this platform, Noor platform, and our system, MIS system, help us in to implement a very strong social protection programs, our regular programs, which is, if you go to the next slide, we have our regular programs that give services to around 100,000 households. And in COVID-19 crisis, we are able to implement an emergency program which covers for the unemployed or for the informal worker people, which we could include 250,000 households in this program. And also we are implementing our regular programs or the government support programs like bread subsidy, which we gave our service to around 1.1 million family. We have the energy subsidy, the transportation, the health insurance, many of the government subsidies that are provided through the MIS system that is connected to Noor platform, which is all depending on the national ID. And thank you. This is my presentation.
Thank you, Nahla. Thank you very much. You basically highlighted how important it is to have a national unified registry as something against which you can check, you can cross-validate, but then anybody in need, you bring them in through campaigns, they can make a claim, and then you're using this essentially oracle, this database that tells you the ground truth about these people. So that's an important point to keep in mind. One quick question for you, which came up in here. In the COVID interventions that you have done, where you allowed the opening of e-wallets, I assume at the end of the day, the beneficiaries will receive this e-wallet account and they can use it for any other purpose. It's not just restricted to receiving your cash transfers. Is that correct?
Yes, sure.
Okay, but then how's KYC working? Did you have to minimize KYC? Because now they have an e-wallet account, and I imagine the Bank of Jordan must have some sort of requirements not to open up bank accounts for anybody. How does that work?
Yes, and this is what makes it, this is what makes CBG to facilitate this process to issue a new kind of accounts called the basic accounts for the banks and the e-wallets. The basic bank account and the basic e-wallet account. These accounts are built for those people who need to use it for minimum uses like cash in, cash out, without taking loans or do other services. Yes, for this help those people to easily open this account through an application, and he can do it online at his home, everywhere. And this is we use this in the COVID-19 when there is a full curfew and no one can go out and the banks are closed, the e-wallet companies or the agents are closed. So they open the accounts through these applications, and directly we collect this data from the job back company or the CBG through the national ID cross-checking for these accounts.
Excellent. So it's digital identity all the way from basically eligibility, targeting, to opening up a bank account, to using, etc. So very nice story. Thank you very much. Sorry, we don't have much more time to keep you with us, but thank you for your time and participation. I'd like to move on and ask Senegal for their story. Senegal is a different story here. It is about an initiative that is slightly different than cash transfers. And I think it will be in French, in which case I ask those of you who need the translation to switch to the English channel if you are not on the English channel, so you can hear the translation. Mohamed, c'est à vous maintenant.
D'accord. Merci, Président. Donc, je transmets le bonjour à tous les participants et merci à ID4Africa de nous faire l'honneur de présenter en fait l'identité numérique provisoire dans le contexte de la lutte contre la COVID-19, qui est en fait une initiative qui a été mise en œuvre au Sénégal dans le cadre en fait du contexte COVID-19. Pour riposter contre la COVID-19, le Sénégal en fait a fait au sein donc du Sénégal, on a organisé aujourd'hui toutes les parties prenantes à travers en fait une initiative citoyenne bénévole qui permet de fédérer en fait les ressources digitales du pays en fait dans le but d'endiguer la pandémie COVID-19 au Sénégal grâce au digital. C'est à peu près plus de 600 volontaires, donc des entreprises, des particuliers, mais également l'administration publique qui se sont regroupés au sein d'une coalition qu'on appelle DAN COVID-19, qui est une plateforme digitale donc, de plusieurs acteurs et qui se sont regroupés pour mettre à la disposition du Sénégal des solutions digitales en faveur du ministère de la Santé, essentiellement, mais également de tous les autres secteurs qui ont été impactés par la COVID-19. Et c'est pour justement lutter contre la COVID-19 que ces solutions digitales ont été mises en place. Et il a été retenu dans le cadre de toujours la lutte contre la COVID-19, parce qu'on avait constaté que par-delà le ministère de la Santé, qu'il y avait beaucoup d'autres secteurs qui avaient été impactés par la COVID-19 et du fait que le gouvernement avait pris des mesures d'urgence pour lutter contre la COVID-19 en décidant justement de limiter les accès aux structures publiques à la population. Et durant cette période, beaucoup de structures ne fonctionnaient plus et les administrations qui offraient des services publics aux citoyens ne pouvaient plus le faire. Donc, ayant constaté que d'autres secteurs avaient été impactés, la coalition d'An-Covid-19 a pris l'initiative de mettre en place en fait l'identifiant numérique provisoire pour justement essayer de combler en fait ce vide qu'on avait, pour que même en période de catastrophe, que les services puissent être délivrés de façon continue grâce au digital, en mettant en place une identité numérique provisoire qui permettrait à tout un chacun de pouvoir être identifié et de pouvoir avoir accès aux services qui sont délivrés par les structures publiques, mais également par les structures du privé. Et c'est dans ce contexte qu'on a décidé de la mise en place de cette plateforme, dont l'objectif est d'attribuer et de gérer ou d'intégrer les identités numériques des personnes physiques ou morales au Sénégal. Donc, pour les usagers, l'identité numérique provisoire va permettre de faciliter l'accès aux services publics à travers un identifiant unique qui est fiable et sécurisé. Donc, pour l'État, ça permet donc de contribuer à l'interopérabilité et à la mise en cohérence des données qui sont liées directement ou déduites des personnes physiques ou morales. Et pour les fournisseurs de services, même privés, comme les banques, les télécoms, les assureurs, etc., ils permettent d'attester, de certifier ou d'approuver en fait l'identité d'une personne physique ou morale pour un bien ou un service. Maintenant, comment cette plateforme elle a été mise en place? Parce que pour mettre en place en fait l'identité numérique provisoire, on a déjà deux plateformes. Donc, on a une plateforme d'émission de l'identité numérique provisoire et on a une plateforme d'acceptation de l'identité numérique provisoire. Pour la plateforme d'émission de l'identité numérique provisoire, donc il s'agit pour n'importe quel utilisateur, usager, de pouvoir venir s'enrôler en ligne au niveau du portail d'émission de l'identité numérique provisoire. Cette plateforme permet de s'enrôler en ligne pour bénéficier d'une identité numérique, de compléter son enrôlement, de détenir son identité. Donc, l'identité pourra être utilisée sur n'importe quel type de support, de pouvoir avoir accès maintenant aux services publics.
Mohamed, did we lose you? Vous êtes là, Mohamed? I think there might be a problem with the connection in the internet. Okay. So, operator, could you please try to reestablish the connection? If not, what we can do is we can move on to the next segment of the presentation. If we lost Senegal online, could you please try to verify?
Okay, c'est bon.
Ah, he's back. Okay.
Bon,
great.
okay.
Great.
Donc,
okay.
L'idée, c'est de dire que les identités sectorielles, on les garde. On ne touche pas aux identités sectorielles, mais maintenant, la plateforme d'émission de l'identité numérique provisoire va également embarquer ce qu'on appelle un trousseau d'identité. Et le trousseau d'identité va permettre de rattacher les autres identités sectorielles à l'identité numérique principale qu'on vient de créer. Okay? Et ainsi, le bénéficiaire peut mettre à jour son identité en fonction du niveau de sécurité auquel les plateformes d'acceptation exigent pour pouvoir accéder donc à certains services. Okay? C'est pourquoi toujours au niveau des fonctionnalités maintenant, pour ce qui concerne l'administration publique, il y a la partie administration publique où l'administration publique peut elle-même enrôler des personnes physiques ou morales, délivrer une identité à la personne enrôlée, définir le niveau de sécurité de l'identité, parce qu'au niveau de l'identité numérique provisoire, on a 3 niveaux de sécurité par défaut. Un niveau de sécurité où on peut se connecter, par exemple, pour accéder à des services juste à travers un mot de passe. Un niveau de sécurité où on a besoin d'un certificat pour confirmer notre identité. Et un troisième niveau de sécurité beaucoup plus élevé où on a besoin d'avoir en fait un accès à la biométrie pour accéder à certains services. Donc cette identité, elle peut être partagée avec les structures de l'État et on peut autoriser aussi à une structure de l'État de vérifier l'identité d'une personne physique ou morale. Et enfin, il y a un module qui permet de délivrer un quitus sur la fiabilité de l'INP de l'individu physique ou moral. Okay. Sur maintenant, pour les fournisseurs de services, ça peut être les banques, les opérateurs telco, etc. Ils peuvent souscrire aux services de vérification et de certification de l'INP. Ça nous permet, nous, de mettre en place des API pour pouvoir leur permettre d'accéder à l'INP. Donc, ils peuvent vérifier et certifier l'INP en ligne et aussi, et maintenant, fournir le bien ou le service à l'usager qu'ils viennent d'identifier. En termes d'architecture technique, voici comment aujourd'hui la plateforme se présente. On a au niveau architecture technique, on a deux volets. Si vous pouvez mettre le slide suivant. On a, comme vous voyez, d'une part, le portail de souscription de l'identité numérique provisoire. Et d'autre part, à travers les web services, on a les plateformes d'acceptation de cette identité numérique provisoire où une fois que la personne est enregistrée dans la plateforme de l'identité numérique provisoire, il peut maintenant rajouter ses autres identités dans son trousseau d'identité. Il peut rajouter son identité bancaire, il peut rajouter son identité par rapport à l'éducation, il peut rajouter son identité pour accéder aux services de l'impôt, etc. Parce que ces services ont déjà des identités sectorielles et on ne voulait pas y toucher. Mais toutes ces identités sectorielles maintenant peuvent être embarquées dans le trousseau d'identité au niveau de la plateforme d'émission de l'identité numérique provisoire, ce qui fait que maintenant cet utilisateur, il a juste besoin d'une seule identité, hein, c'est comme s'il utilisait un SSO pour pouvoir se connecter dans tous les services auxquels il a droit d'accès, aussi bien pour les services de l'État que les autres. Donc ce module, donc, comme vous voyez, est décomposé en trois fonctionnalités, le module enrôlement, le module certification et le module gestion des accès, où on va, pour surtout le module de gestion des accès, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, on a les différents niveaux d'identité qui sont définis, où pour accéder à certains services, il a juste besoin de son identité numérique avec un mot de passe. Dans d'autres services, il a besoin de son identité numérique, mais avec une certification, une tierce certification. Et enfin, dans certains services où il a besoin d'un accès beaucoup plus fort, on fait appel à la biométrie. Donc voilà comment aujourd'hui on a mis en place ce dispositif. Et au moment où on est actuellement, on est en train de travailler sur l'implémentation de la plateforme avec l'hébergement directement au niveau de l'Agence de l'informatique de l'État, le déploiement du POC par la structure Gaindé 2000, parce que c'est une approche de co-construction où on a plusieurs acteurs qui se sont fédérés pour bâtir ensemble ce dispositif. Et on va démarrer la diffusion de l'identité numérique avec des structures pilotes qu'on a identifiées, telles que la couverture maladie universelle, la CMU, le système d'information de l'éducation nationale, la solde pour payer les salaires des fonctionnaires, le dispositif de l'impôt et également les banques et télécoms. Pour chacune de ces structures-là, on va développer les interfaces API pour leur permettre maintenant de pouvoir embarquer l'identifiant numérique provisoire dans les services. Ce qui nous permet aujourd'hui de régler la problématique de l'identité numérique provisoire sans pour autant toucher aux identités numériques sectorielles. Donc, les plateformes sectorielles gardent leur identité et aujourd'hui, on a une identité numérique principale provisoire qui permet de rattacher toutes ces identités numériques à travers le trousseau d'identité et permettre à tout un chacun d'avoir accès maintenant aux services de l'État, même en cas de situation de catastrophe, vous pouvez continuer à avoir accès aux services en ligne grâce à votre identité numérique provisoire. Donc voilà la plateforme que le Sénégal est en train donc de mettre en place suite en fait aux événements dans le Covid. Suite aux événements en fait, de la COVID-19, on a constaté qu'on avait besoin d'avoir une identité numérique pour pouvoir continuer à avoir accès aux services de l'État, mais aussi aux services privés, même en cas de crise. Merci.
Oui, Mohamed, merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Il y a quelques questions rapidement. En fait, le système d'information sectoriel sont une forme d'attestation. Il fournit l'attestation pour valider que cette personne existe, et cette personne bien c'est qu'elle prétend de l'être, mais c'est eux qui vont maintenir l'information authentique. C'est eux qui vont maintenir. Vous ne touchez pas à ça.
C'est ça.
C'est juste par un lien API pour valider que la personne est niveau 1, niveau 2, niveau 3, selon le nombre d'attestations que vous avez accès.
Exactement. Aujourd'hui, on sait que ces structures sectorielles ont déjà fait le travail préalable d'identifier leurs bénéficiaires et de leur attribuer en fait un accès à leurs services, et leur ont attribué en fait un code d'accès à ces services-là. Donc ce travail, nous, on n'a plus besoin de le refaire. Le travail que nous faisons, nous, c'est justement d'agréger toutes ces identités sectorielles-là sur un réceptacle unique et de sécuriser ce réceptacle unique. Et maintenant, pour chaque sectoriel, il y a un niveau d'accès aux services du sectoriel qui ont été définis par cette plateforme d'acceptation qui est sectorielle. Et donc, nous, ce qu'on fait, c'est qu'on essaie maintenant de rattacher le niveau de sécurité qui est nécessaire à l'accès à ces services de la plateforme d'acceptation.
Mais vous considérez la carte nationale d'identité comme une identifiant sectorielle?
Non.
Mais il y a un identifiant unique attribué à la carte nationale d'identité. C'est faux ou pas?
Oui, c'est vrai. Mais pourquoi ce n'est pas sectoriel? Parce que nous considérons que la carte d'identité nationale, elle est transversale. Elle n'est pas sectorielle. Et c'est pourquoi, pour nous, tout ce qui est dispositif d'identité fondamentale, on n'a pas voulu utiliser l'identité fondamentale pour délivrer l'identité numérique, parce qu'on considère l'identité fondamentale comme quelque chose de transversal et qu'il appartenait à ces structures sectorielles de s'assurer, elles, de l'identité du bénéficiaire avant de lui délivrer ce service. Dès l'instant qu'ils ont fait ce travail de s'assurer de l'identité du bénéficiaire, nous, on n'a plus besoin d'utiliser la carte nationale d'identité comme une identité sectorielle, parce que c'est une identité transversale qui a été déjà utilisée par ces sectoriels-là.
Mais est-ce qu'il y aura des numéros, deux numéros, les numéros provisoires et les numéros de carte nationale d'identité? Comment vous allez gérer les deux numéros? Non? C'est pas en concurrence?
Oui. Le problème qu'on a, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, jusqu'au jour où je vous parle, quand on offre en fait aujourd'hui un service qui est de dimension nationale, ce service, il est transnationalité. Ça veut dire que aujourd'hui, la carte d'identité nationale, elle est limitée à une catégorie de la population qui est d'abord une population majeure et qui est une population sénégalaise. Donc forcément, il y a une catégorie de la population qui aujourd'hui doit avoir accès à des services et qui n'a pas de carte d'identité nationale pour justement s'identifier à ces services-là. On prend le cas des étrangers, mais on prend le cas, par exemple, des moins de 18 ans. Alors que ces gens-là, on doit pouvoir les identifier. Et donc, le problème, nous, c'est pour que ce soit un dispositif universel, on ne veut pas prendre, en fait, un élément d'identification qui ne nous permet pas d'avoir une universalité. Si la carte d'identité nationale, au jour d'aujourd'hui, nous permettait d'avoir une universalité au niveau de tous les Sénégalais, on aurait pu le prendre comme élément. On n'aurait même pas eu besoin d'avoir une identité numérique à côté de la carte d'identité nationale. On aurait pu directement prendre le numéro d'identifiant national et le mettre comme identifiant unique. Mais le problème qu'il y a aujourd'hui, c'est que la carte d'identité nationale, aussi bien, c'est le même problème qu'on a avec l'état civil, hein, parce que l'état civil ne couvre pas encore toute la population sénégalaise. Il y a encore 35% de Sénégalais qui n'ont pas de carte d'identité, qui n'ont pas d'état civil et qui doivent aussi avoir accès à ces services en ligne.
OK. Merci beaucoup, Mohamed. C'est un sujet très intéressant. Peut-être on va suivre ça dans des épisodes prochainement. OK. Merci beaucoup pour cette intervention. We are going to make a slight change in the program to accommodate some of the changes in the availability of the panelists. I'd like to take a little break from the PowerPoint discussion and have an in-conversation with R.Karanja, just a 10-minute break, and discuss the in-conversation with Omidyar Network R.Karanja. And then we'll come back to a topic, which is the topic of the refugees. My apologies for that change, but stand by. Can you please bring R.Karanja to the panel? I think he's with us from Nairobi. Robert, apologies for that change, but I understand you've got constraints, so we're happy to accommodate. Welcome to the ID for Africa livecast. And before we start our conversation, I'd like to recognize Omidyar Network as being a development partner of ID for Africa. You've been with us for a couple of years now. I'd like to thank you for your continued support of the movement. So first, I know Omidyar has made some strategic reorganizations. Do you care briefly to share with our viewers what this reorganization entails and situate your activities in Africa within the new strategic structure?
Yes, thank you, Joseph, and thank you for having me on the panel. And just to indicate that, Omidyar has or is investing and working in a stream of work which we call ID in the African digital economy. And within this work stream, we are, of course, working with various partners, various stakeholders across the continent. For example, some of the multilateral agencies. So we have invested in organizations such as the Smart Africa Secretariat in Kigali. We've invested in UNECA's Center for Digital Excellence in Addis Ababa. And we've also invested in the World Bank's ID4D program. And essentially, what Omidyar is looking at doing is, we do know that several African governments across the continent are planning on rolling out digital identity systems over the next few years. And we are keen on playing our role in the rollout of these digital identity systems to influence governments through a combination of norms and multilaterals. And we feel that if we can engage the multilateral agencies, we'll be able to continue to strengthen the good ID framework that the governments will be rolling out. In addition, we are keen on holding governments to account through civil society. So we're investing in various civil society partners across the continent. And we believe that by strengthening the capacity of African civil society and independent media around design and policy for digital ID, then we do better prepare them to hold their governments accountable as they roll out ID systems. And then finally, of the countries that are rolling out ID systems over the next few years, we do have a specific country focus. So we are focusing on Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. And there are opportunities to work in other countries, such as more recently in Sudan, on digital identity. And we feel that if we strengthen the capacity of our partners to reduce information asymmetry, engage on specific ID policy considerations more effectively, then these governments will implement ID systems that incorporate some of the specific elements of good ID. Yeah.
Well, you've heard the panelists so far. I mean, talking about the need to act in urgency. Everything feels now much more expedited. We can no longer operate on the assumption that time is on our side. The economies are in grave danger, and the social protection programs are in desperate needs to get assistance to the public. In this challenging environment, and without appearing or sounding like it's gloomy, I mean, we've got hope, we've got ability to make changes. What do you think the development agenda priorities should be? What should we as a development community and development partners should we be focusing on to be responsive to the current reality?
Thank you, Joseph. I think if we look at the effects of the pandemic across the continent, the fact is that the COVID pandemic has exposed the underbelly of not having the systems in place in the first place. And so many African countries have had to roll out fairly quickly rudimentary support systems to support vulnerable populations within their countries. And so I think that has been a key focus to help citizens in various countries across the continent be able to absorb the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think we can learn from this because I don't believe this will be the first pandemic. I don't believe it will be the first shock of this type. And going forward, we can pick up some lessons from this and perhaps be better prepared going forward. Joseph, I must also say that in some of the countries that we're looking at and that we were focused on initially, there's been postponement of elections, from this year to different years, and for one reason or another. And I think it's important that that governments also look at, the rollout of whether it's ID systems, support, social support to vulnerable populations as being an important facet of what they do on a day-to-day basis, right? And COVID just simply exposed that underbelly. But I think going forward, more governments will be better prepared.
I think the challenge that we're struggling with right now when we talk to the identity stakeholders in various countries is the fear that absent institutionalization frameworks of what they're doing, it looks like what they're doing one-offs again. Just like you remember when we used to talk about the voter registration campaigns, which every 5 years they keep repeating and the investment goes down the drain. So how do we balance the need to act quickly, yet the need to build durable deliverables and elements that we can actually utilize again and again for improving resilience of these countries? Is there any policy ideas that we can discuss that help countries?
Sure. I think one clear example that I can think of is the setting up of institutions, independent institutions such as DPAs across the continent, for example. A fair number of countries are moving towards not only putting in place legislation, but they're also putting in place DPAs. And DPAs are envisioned as independent institutions that will be there for a long time to come. Institutions that ideally should not be dependent on which government is in power on that particular day. And institutions that can hold government accountable when it comes to data protection and issues around privacy and that type of thing. And I think that's a good step for many African countries in setting up these institutions that are deemed to be there for a long time to come, rather than having short-term spurts or short-term investments that really are not sustainable.
So, I mean, basically, you're talking about the building of capacity and the building of institutions that can absorb that capacity to make sure that any developments that we do, any investments that you make are looked at within the long-term perspective. I mean, you are creating investments within the context of institutions and capacity that goes with it. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization, correct.
Okay, and so I recently, you have launched a very interesting initiative, which is the African Data Leadership Initiative. Do you care to share about what this is about and how does Africa participate and benefit from that initiative?
Sure. The ADLI is essentially an initiative that brings the strength of a tripartite arrangement between the Smart Africa Secretariat and, of course, UNECA's Center for Digital Excellence to really leverage on the strengths and the convening power of both these institutions, who, of course, have the ear of government and decision makers. And the ADLI essentially looks at how best can we position these institutions to work better together, to be able to also leverage on their strengths, be able to reach out to whether it's government ministers, regulatory authorities in these countries that they work in, to advance the narrative around data privacy protection issues across the continent, rather than working independently and perhaps not speaking to each other as often as they should. So the ADLI really looks at strengthening that arrangement with the hope that these regional multilateral agencies do also have influence at the national level and with decision makers.
Right. I mean, basically, we are entering into an era which is a sort of a data economy, but also data for shock response. I mean, we've heard throughout the presentations just now that actually data that's being aggregated and linked is being used to make informed policy decisions. So more than ever, data is becoming the key to dealing with shocks, but also reigniting or restarting the African economy. And so do you see Omidyar having, going forward, a data focus in Africa?
I don't know if we could describe it as a data focus, but I'll tell you this for a fact. Data is now officially a factor of production, right? So I remember the old 4 factors of production. Data is now a factor of production. And if we look at the largest companies in the world, take the list from 1 to 10, they're all significant data holders. That's all they do, right? You name them, Apple, Google, you name them.
Right.
And so I think the role in which Omidyar can really play in this space is looking at ID within the African digital economy, so a broader perspective, and perhaps even looking at how can some of these systems, how can some of these initiatives also help actualize long-term perspectives, such as the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Right? How can it help African countries and Africans really trade better, speak to each other on a regular basis? And so we're really looking at it broadly from a digital economy perspective. And the digital economy can mean almost anything that touches our day-to-day way of doing business.
Right. Without putting you on the spot, in the last moment, one of the activities that Omidyar does within the responsible technology segment of Omidyar is the sort of the big tech platforms, making sure the big tech platforms are not dominating or doing harm, etc. How do you do that? How do you protect Africa from the big tech platforms becoming the de facto and therefore imposing an asymmetrical relationship between the producers of data and the consumers of data?
Joseph, you did put me on the spot, but I'll respond anyway. I think we do have a team that looks at what we call power in platforms, and of course looking at reducing any negative effects of big tech, because big tech of course has good effects and positive effects. But I think the focus really here is on giving African countries and of course even the private sector within Africa options, right? So rather than get locked into solutions that may be not ideal for what they want to do, how do we give them options? And some of these options are wide and varied. It could include also open source options, for example, rather than engaging in a vendor lock-in that will give the country problems, or private sector, association, institution problems over the long term. So really providing them with options. But at the end of the day, with the hope that when they do make a decision, they will make an informed decision. I think that's the important thing.
Right, and of course, the data sovereignty will continue to be a factor in all of our considerations as we deal with data government. Robert, I would love to stay and chat with you some more, but we're running out of time. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us. It's a pleasure, and thank you for your support.
Thank you.
We'll continue now this program with basically another important segment, which is basically emergency interventions that are necessitated by man-made or natural events which result in refugees and internally displaced people. So we have a very interesting presentation from Andrew Hopkins, Andrew with UNHCR, and then followed by a presentation from Eva from Iris Guard. And so Andrew promised me that he will be quick. He has a beautiful presentation, but it's a bit of a heavy deck. So Andrew, it's up to you. Move quickly, please, and share with us what you see.
Great. Thanks very much, Joseph. I'm very happy to be here today. For UNHCR, an emergency is a situation in which the lives, rights, and well-being of refugees and other persons of concern are threatened unless immediate and appropriate action is taken. The action required is usually on a scale that UNHCR's existing capacity and regional levels can't provide. Registration is one of UNHCR's primary activities at the onset of an emergency, and it enables UNHCR and partners not only to establish a reliable population baseline for program and planning purposes, but it allows us to interact face-to-face with displaced populations to identify and assist persons with specific needs. It also allows us to establish an identity ecosystem, a baseline, to ensure that ongoing delivery of protection, assistance, and documentation in the medium and long term are covered. Governments take on a greater role in these times in covering registration of displaced populations, but in emergency settings, we find that often the existing functioning ID systems are not adequate to cover, mass arrivals. So we often go hand in hand with government to set up those processes. And our processes are based on registration standards that have been in the organization for quite some time now, including access to registration, the process of registration, management of fraud, what data we want to gather and record, updating and verification, documentation, and of course, data protection, and lastly, partnerships. These are all sort of the guiding principles under which we would engage with governments to conduct registration anywhere in the world in an emergency. We set out a whole curriculum, frankly, to help our officers get on the ground running and managing these very complex situations. These trainings cover everything from determining documentary needs to designing standard operating procedures, interviewing techniques, and frankly, only 10% of the curriculum involves the training on ID software applications. So really, we're looking at a whole logistical endeavor that is quite a bit different than just focusing on the systems. It really is an entire end-to-end exercise that allows us to collect really good data on the people who are streaming across borders. The evolution of our emergency registration and identity management over the years has been really going from very rudimentary systems to quite advanced ones, starting with using wristbands to fix identities, to establish uniqueness, substandard identity documentation where only a family ration card, you can see there in the center photo, is shared amongst family members and quite frankly not adequate to be used as a source of identification. And then moving finally into individual registration and unique identifiers, both at the individual level and at the family level, which was a real game changer for us in managing our populations and helping people. The idea of re-verifying and building data sets collected previously during an emergency is very important to us. And you can see here, this is back in the early 90s where we were actually, using data that we had collected and updating it and collecting additional data fields, pen and paper stuff, but all eventually computerized. Universal access, very important. Outreach away from registration centers so that we can be able to make sure that we have good coverage and that all persons of concern are included. So pre-COVID registration processing was really about putting order into the chaos and having people here. We have photos from Uganda, having people scheduled and meeting with our interviewing officers and government officers to be able to be adequately registered. Huge undertaking. It takes significant thought and planning in setting up large-scale registration activities, negotiations on numerous issues with authorities, strategies, corresponding budgets and equipment and staffing needs, procurement. I mean, it's really a very heavy lift when dealing with an emergency influx. Here you can see how we used to fix populations using wristbands, again, to establish uniqueness before we had biometrics. And then finally, I'm not going to go through the recognized benefits of biometrics, but really it's about anchoring identities so that we can prevent fraud, but also build confidence in identities over time and establish the refugee identity across UNHCR globally. This is a global system, multimodal, which is able to really anchor refugee identities for their assistance and protection over time. So here we secure the identities. We have a near irrefutable linking of food collection and cash collection, even by remote. Obviously, efficiency savings if other agencies or governments are accessing our biometric systems, and centralized and real-time reporting. Biometrics are now used in 73 countries. 8 out of every 10 of our refugees, around 9 million, are registered and biometrically enrolled and have an anchored digital identity. We have global coverage covering about 13.1 million refugees across the world, with a significant penetration in Africa. So our systems and I'll get into this a bit later, our systems were really useful when COVID came along, and I would say that since COVID, the strength of our, we have been challenged fundamentally in all aspects of our lives, and this is especially bad for refugees, because for people who are forced to flee violence or persecution, staying at home to isolate themselves from the virus is really not an option. And access to asylum and other rights that would protect vulnerable refugees has been significantly reduced as countries have responded to the disease. Here we see in Africa several countries across the continent with a major restriction of movement, including closing of borders and even imposing states of emergency. So we really have in the dark here areas where access was denied. In the light blue, we have heavy restrictions, and these are really affecting our populations and our ability to assist them. However, we see that in Africa, in the far left, this is all the world, but on the bar graph here on the far left, Africa is really, in April and May, seeing problems with entry, and then the blockages go way down these recent weeks. So we've seen a trend to admitting more refugees as time passes. This is our registration data port, and it shows that it shows a huge drop in registration from March onwards, where in February we were covering about 70,000 a month, in January and March as well, and then boom, in April we see an incredible drop in the numbers. But the dark blue bar graph here, bars in the graph here, are showing that there is remote registration happening in the organization. I'll get to that in a minute. So what are we doing? We're ensuring physical distancing is introduced across operations. We are making sure that also that our staff are protected and that there is some distance being kept during registration, reception, hand washing, and we've managed to figure out contactless biometrics finally with our system. So there's no contact when we're trying to verify identities on assistance disbursement. Temperature screening as well when we're processing of populations. So what are the challenges? I mean, first, one of our biggest challenges is the use of telecommunications and digital tools. Often there's a lack of connectivity, and this really can affect our refugees' access to services. So connectivity being a huge issue. We don't always understand what the preferred modality of communication should be, and we are also, in remote data collection circumstances, really worried about how the integrity of our registration is being kept together. And so since COVID, we set up, you can see this is a slide from the Ethiopia operation. We've set up several services for remote access to our our registration, being able to make appointments, being able to interact with our staff remotely. And there's a whole sort of process that I won't get into here, given the time constraints, Joseph, but we do have hotline systems being set up all over the world whereby refugees we can interact with our refugees directly and renew their documents and assist them with whatever they're seeking from us. You can see here we have a face-to-face interaction through interviewing with refugees, and this is our only way to register many of our people for cash programs these days. And fortunately, because of our existing ecosystem, we have a way of interacting with refugees through videos and then being able to record their data remotely. So even if a caseworker or a registration officer was sitting at home, they would be able to collect the data. Access to services, we're really thinking into the future now with kiosks, web-based interactions, and mobile applications being able to be used to provide alternative forms of direct processing. This doesn't mean, of course, that we won't need to have at some point a face-to-face verification with the people that we're assisting. But in the interest of assisting in times of COVID, we've had to develop measures like the ones you see here. Sharing data with partners is also a key to our work right now. We need a pragmatic protection delivery approach, I think, with our partners like WFP, major work being done there in Bangladesh and in Sudan right now, IOM as well, and other government partners where we seek interoperability to avoid this headache of collecting data multiple times. And we really want to make sure that our access is controlled, that we respect the data that we're collecting and making sure that it's not irresponsibly shared, and that our biometric system is accessed over transferring the biometrics to another entity. So here we're looking really at the ability of other entities to be able to confirm identities just by accessing in a one-to-one check our system. Just a couple of slides left there, Joseph. The cash that we're delivering in the field right now is, we've done a bit of a survey across the globe, and 88% of the households have reported having access to key services are really key to them, and a clear majority prefer cash as an assistance modality. 65 operations with new or expanded CBI programs, 3.1 million people reached since up until June 2020 is the cutoff date there. And then $339 million US distributed. So that's about 7% more than the same time last year. So, the cash assistance that we're able to provide is certainly key to our programming in all contexts. So in closing, the technological development and digitization are really a global phenomena that profoundly impacts all aspects of everyday society. And while some may see a dystopian element to the new age, we believe that now is the time to shape the new world where people are empowered and not excluded, and where new solutions can help alleviate today's problems. Leaving nobody behind, especially refugees and humanitarian emergencies, applies to all countries and all sectors of society, even in the digital space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Very, very impressive how UNHCR has really adapted and has basically redefined its operational engagements to basically function despite the very, very challenging and difficult conditions imposed by the COVID. Bravo. In fact, we salute you for that effort. A lot of lessons that we can learn from it, and actually not just in the context of emergency response to refugees, but also in the context of service delivery now in government. So with this recording being available, I think people will be able to go over your presentation and distill it into lessons learned. Thank you so much. We will continue in the interest of time with E.Mowbray from Iris Guard, who will address also an area related to refugees. And Eva?
Good afternoon to you all. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be joining. Such a great pleasure. Next slide, please. We are all too familiar with the challenges relating to delivering assistance where preparedness is key. And if the past 8 months have taught us anything, is that the whole world, not just the developing countries, was unprepared. So what role does digital identity play here? Well, there are 1.1 billion people with no ID, 1.7 billion people already unbanked, and the number of those likely to need assistance and social protection is only about to keep increasing due to the current pandemic. I'd say our priority should be to get to a place where A, short-term vulnerable people have immediate and uninterrupted access to help, and B, long-term IDPs and refugees are actively participating in the global economy. Next slide, please. We've had the privilege to serve millions of beneficiaries in developing regions with value partners such as the UNHCR. They have spearheaded the transformation from a voucher-based system to a biometric-based system, which is more efficient and faster and accurate. So refugees can now walk up to an ATM and withdraw cash without a bank card, buy groceries in a supermarket and pay contactless using their biometric. They can receive their cash assistance via a mobile wallet. It has put the beneficiary first, it's given them back their dignity, provided cash directly to women through the UN Women Project, and it stopped fraud. In Lebanon, for example, there was a requirement to provide proof of life to ensure that owners of prepaid cards were legitimate. 26% of those cards were not. Next slide, please. And then COVID-19 happened. We were all in lockdown and certain locations in those regions were completely restricted, posing huge challenges for safe aid distribution. This is where technology adds real value, but setting up a new system or bringing in a new tech in an emergency situation is a risky prospect. Fortunately, the biometric system was integrated with an existing beneficiary database, so operationally, nothing had to change to keep aid going. Mobile cash vans by K.Srarah Bank were bringing cash literally straight to displaced people in Jordan. Cash was distributed door to door by UNHCR and a mobile wallet operator in a refugee camp in Iraq, also via post offices in Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. The ability to distribute assistance using technology which utilizes contact-free biometric system and therefore works with masks and gloves meant that it was done safely. But there are still challenges and opportunities on the road ahead. And today we'll focus on 4 specific areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So accountability. Number 1, more governments and aid agencies need to support a growing number of people. It takes time to negotiate service points and different systems may not be compatible. And with funding under increased pressure, donors are demanding accountability, a proof that aid's been received by those entitled to it. Very often, proof of delivery burden can sit with the field staff. We used our social security numbers to prove our identity. They weren't designed for that purpose and they aren't secure enough with the growing need to digitally register millions of people. It's absolutely critical to eliminate the identity fraud because that stretches precious funding, saving 20% in the Syrian crisis alone. That situation was not expected to be long-term crisis, yet in its 8th year, that's a pretty significant number. One of those learnings has been that consideration must be given to requirements for long-term. We know that average time of being a refugee, 17 years. So what happens when refugees or asylum seekers are resettled in a different region? Do they have to re-register again? Will that open up room for fraud? And of course, there is a matter of resource and time. So I think to conclude this point, adding a biometric step to an identity program ties a live person to a verified digital ID, makes it really, really hard for fraud to happen. And of course, as we've heard today, can be utilized for other purposes should that be needed without having to re-enroll again. Next slide, please. Thinking about implementing such a system, though, having verified onboarding process and security for data, huge variety of parameters depending on what's being distributed, the ability to scale it up or down, resistance to disease, the donor's requirements, and on top of that, utilizing biometrics. It's a pretty challenging task, one which usually falls with the responsibility of the IT team. And those decisions, they can have a lasting impact for many years to come, with commitments, building new systems and databases and payment portals and reporting dashboards. So this is where public-private partnerships play a key role. Private organizations and fintech companies, for example, they bring rapid innovation and flexibility to the table, whilst NGOs know what's needed on the ground. So there are some really strong reasons for them to join hands in bringing those solutions in the area, using the technology available, integrating systems to be more reliable and resilient. Next slide, please. And that leads me on to the third challenge, which has also been addressed today by several of my colleagues on the panel. We're dealing with sensitive personal data, which must be protected and in some instances be anonymous for the protection of the beneficiaries and their entitlements. Loss of data is a serious risk. The consequences to those who are affected with regards to their privacy and potential identity theft are huge. And on the other side, it's hugely damaging to reputation. Technology has made some real strides in keeping data secure, and it's part of our everyday life. You know, my bank, my insurance company, my supermarket, online stores, my GP, not to forget social media, they all hold huge amount of data about me, and there must be trust that it will be protected. The key part here, of course, is, do I willingly consent to providing that data? Do I have to or not have to provide it? Do I understand how it will be used and who by? So we could debate the pros and cons of using biometrics for quite some time, I think, and we recognize both. In reality, I think if we achieve a balance of robust safeguarding and protection to ensure no harm can be done, then the benefits are truly groundbreaking. Cards, passports, certificates, bank accounts, phones, they can all be stolen and sold. However, a robust biometric system doesn't actually need to use any of those and can protect beneficiaries and what's rightfully theirs. We'll probably never get to 100% biometric usage in any system. Perhaps the compromise is for beneficiary to choose if their biometric record is collected or not. And if we get to say 80–90%, that will still bring lots of benefits. Next slide, please. So whether we're seeing a solution for during an emergency or post-emergency situation, there is a real need to rethink KYC criteria to develop more accessible and affordable financial services, which is directly linked to having a verified ID. By enabling people to work or set up businesses, they'll create a trail of financial transactions. They'll be able to build up a credit history, savings, pensions. They'll be able to contribute to the local community that they reside in, and verified and authenticated user data. They are the foundations to improve those core financial services, but of course that comes at a cost. Whether a project is large or small or one-off or long-term, IT people will know that with software implementation, they have to pay for licenses. And there is hardware and servers, cost for ongoing authentication, ensuring the integrity of KYC, etc. Each project will carry that cost. So to address this challenge, maybe we consider creating new aid hubs, which actually is not a new idea, as there are already networks like the Common Cash Facility, which is made up of 34 organizations, 22 of those are NGOs, and they are distributing multiple types of assistance to beneficiaries using one system. But this could evolve. Imagine this using, including banks, post offices, remittance agents, money exchanges, mobile wallets, pharmacies, supermarkets, who between them all increase distribution points, the variety of aid without the repeated setup cost. Also beneficial for rapid deployment because the distribution point's already there, and if one fails for one reason or another, then there is backup. And the last slide, please. So to wrap up, I hope I've been able to highlight some of the benefits of having an established and secure platform which utilizes biometrics for both registration and authentication. At our end, we're looking to extend the usage of existing data in Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco without needing to re-register, so that we can offer the services that I've described to people of Africa. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eva, very much. Basically, operator, could you bring back all the panelists who are still with us, just for a parting word or two? While they're coming on board, I have to say, it gives me real pride to see that the identity community, our community, is stepping up to the challenge and is responding to the crises in the world by providing positive solutions, by providing informed policies that are making a difference in the lives of people. This is not theoretical stuff. This is not making small difference to the bottom line of a country. This is not a statistical. This is the lives of people that are being impacted, and the urgency of their needs presses on us the need to work together as all the stakeholders as one to basically make sure that our capabilities, our lessons, and anything that has succeeded in certain parts of the world is transmitted to other countries. I don't think the pandemic is going to be the last crisis. The refugees, we keep saying this is going to end, there's something, a new world order is going to happen, but it keeps getting worse. So we live in a world that is challenged, and therefore it requires new thinking. So I want to thank all of the panelists for contributing to this intense session in a very meaningful way. And I will just give you the chance to make a 1-minute closing remarks. If you don't have, you can just say, it was nice to see you all, and then wish us best. But anyway, I will start with R.Palacios with the closing words.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks for hosting this. And I've learned so much from all the panelists. I guess I want to take the opportunity, since this is so focused on social protection, to say one last word on that. Before COVID, we were already seeing a consensus for the need to expand social assistance programs to cover more people, and not so much narrow targeting, but broader parts of the population receiving some assistance. Aside from the book that I mentioned, Protecting All, we also put out a book last year on universal basic income. There's been a lot of discussion about that. It's a lot of that tied to reform of energy subsidies and so on. So that was already happening, but COVID really showed what was necessary. Aside from the financial resources, it showed what infrastructure was needed to actually scale up and achieve this expansion of social assistance that was being discussed. And it shows us what pieces have to be in place to do it. Social registries, virtual or traditional, need to be built and cover the majority of the population. And to build a good social registry, you can't really do it without a good ID underpinning it. And so I think it's a very clear line from the expansion of social protection, social insurance, and social assistance to social registry development, to the underlying ID system having to be in place. And I see countries like the Philippines realizing this and rushing to put those pieces in place so that they're better prepared for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. R.Karanja, please.
Thank you, Joseph. And just really to sign off by saying that I look forward to the countries the sub-Saharan African countries that will roll out ID systems over the next few years, aspiring to get as close as possible to the good ID norms, both in design and implementation. And of course, we are tracking a number of countries very closely. Kenya is one of them, Ethiopia and Nigeria among others. And so we really look at those countries as perhaps taking the lead and others following. In addition, we're also very focused on building the capacity of civil society, whether it's NGOs, media, consumer groups, to provide them with the right tools and capabilities to hold governments as well as other major funding agencies to account. And this will be reflected in the ability to make some specific changes in the tech policy landscape in the countries in which they work. So really looking forward to those two as successes over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. K.Srarah, unmute, please.
I want to thank you for having us today and give us the opportunity to talk about our experience. I have nothing to say, but I want to raise one point that this crisis have make us know that how is the information is a power, and the countries that have the information and have the databases and have the data in it's available for the government, these countries who can respond quickly for the crisis. So the information is important. We need to build and learn from this crisis that we need to build a strong databases that have all the information that we need in the future. We hope we didn't face such a crisis in the future, but we should be ready for any bad things happen in the future.
Okay, thank you, Hala. Mohammed, thank you very much. Mohammed, c'est à vous maintenant. Vous êtes sur mute. Mohammed, vous m'entendez? Mohammed, enlevez le mute. Oh, voilà.
Merci Joseph, merci de nous avoir encore une fois donné l'opportunité d'échanger avec toutes ces parties prenantes du monde de l'identité. Nous, aujourd'hui, en fait, la crise Covid nous a montré en fait qu'aujourd'hui, c'est fondamental de passer par le digital pour améliorer en fait le service aux citoyens. Et on ne peut pas aujourd'hui offrir des services sur le digital sans une bonne identité digitale. Donc ça, la COVID-19 est venue renforcer, nous, les certitudes qu'on avait sur la nécessité d'utiliser le digital pour améliorer le service aux citoyens. Et pour pouvoir faire en fait un bon usage du digital, il faut que le citoyen ait une identité numérique pour qu'on ait une garantie de pouvoir lui adresser le service qui lui est destiné. Et c'est pourquoi ce projet d'identité numérique provisoire que nous avons démarré, en tout cas au Sénégal, on espère qu'il va être très prochainement une identité définitive qui sera adoptée par toutes les parties prenantes, qui sera adoptée par tous les secteurs d'activité de l'économie sénégalaise, pour que le Sénégalais, même s'il n'a pas en fait aujourd'hui une identité, une carte d'identité nationale, ou s'il n'est pas inscrit au niveau de l'état civil, alors qu'on a la certitude que c'est un Sénégalais, il a le droit d'accéder à certains services, qu'on puisse avoir, à travers l'identité numérique, la possibilité de lui délivrer les services. Et pour éviter aussi qu'en situation de crise, que les administrations sont fermées, que quand même les gens continuent à avoir accès aux services de l'État via le digital. Et donc aujourd'hui, le gros challenge qu'on a au Sénégal, c'est de pousser justement ces acteurs sectoriels à adopter aujourd'hui l'identité numérique provisoire, à accepter de fédérer autour d'une identité principale toutes les identités sectorielles qu'on a aujourd'hui pour que l'identité numérique soit véritablement une réalité au Sénégal. Okay. Donc, remercie encore une fois de votre attention. Merci.
Merci Mohamed. Il faut dire que Mohamed est l'ambassadeur de ID for Africa au Sénégal. Eva, your turn.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, what I would close with, I would say, similar to what I've mentioned earlier, solid ID infrastructure supported in partnership by governments, UN aid agencies and private sector, maintaining high and agreed standards for protection and privacy of data, which has to be obtained by consent, and that those ID systems ultimately are used for, or I suppose giving people who need to use them access to a range of different services, whilst removing the need of time to spend on negotiating contracts and looking for service providers, etc., so that they're set up, they're established, and aid can start being delivered as soon as it's required. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Molly, si vous voulez parler en français, ça va.
Ok, donc je vais continuer en français. Merci de m'avoir donné l'opportunité à participer à ceci. Ça a été très instructif, essentiellement le programme sénégalais. Je pense qu'on va s'en inspirer pour nos projets futurs. Et désolé que la barrière de la langue a fait qu'on n'a pas pu plus échanger sur notre programme. Donc ici, nous sommes ouverts à tout échange. Et si jamais il y a d'autres opportunités comme ça, essentiellement concernant le programme ID for Africa, nous sommes disponibles et on va suivre le programme et participer de façon proactive. Merci beaucoup.
Merci pour votre soutien aussi. Merci pour le soutien de Madame la ministre, Madame Sina Lawson, pour le soutien à ID for Africa et la participation de nos activités.
Merci.
Okay, Andrew, can you close us up with your remarks?
Yes, thank you very much, Joseph. You know, just not wanting to repeat what Mohammed said, but it really is a question of redefining access through digital means for us. And what COVID has taught us is that outreach needs to happen in an entirely new and inventive way. UNHCR is trying to move in that direction, but it's not easy. And, you know, refugees, in particular, people fleeing conflict and persecution, need to be included, as they often flee with nothing, no passports, nothing. And we need to help them navigate the identity systems in their countries of asylum, so that they may be recognized and included in the societies where they find themselves. So thank you very much today, Joseph. Excellent panelists, very interesting exchange, and appreciate the invitation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew, to you and to UNHCR. I know you guys are very, very busy right now, and having taken the time to be with us means a lot to us. So this is the end, and I will just say goodbye to everybody, and we will be seeing you again November 5th, where we will do the Tanzania ecosystem. This is a panel where we discuss with all the identity stakeholders the progress and how they work together towards a harmonized ID platform and that delivers services and that includes everybody and is very responsible. So there will be no presentations at that time. It will be essentially like we did with the Nigeria. I encourage you to take a look at that episode. It's very, very informative. Tanzania is a different model, but it's good to have a catalog of many of these African countries, which we will be doing. So once again, thank you all for staying with us through this. This has been very wonderful exchange of information. I learned a lot. And I also thank every single panelist for their valuable contributions. So goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See.